I'm Joy Mboya, and currently I'm the Executive Director of the GoDown Arts Centre. We're an art space that is multidisciplinary in supporting both performing artists and visual artists. But of course we also engage with questions of the bigger sector, the creative sector, looking at issues of policy and looking at the intersection of cultural work or creative work with other issues of society. For me, architecture was a bridge between a scientific bent and a creative, artistic bent. And I think that maybe you young people are luckier these days that you can probably pursue things that you want. But certainly I had to make a choice between either staying with the sciences or deciding to be in the arts. And of course, family very much encouraged that you stay with the sciences, that perhaps there was better opportunity there. So I decided to do architecture as that sort of a bridge. But I've always been interested in the arts. I was very much interested in music. I studied music in high school. And even in university, I took music programs, even though they were a very minor subject for me. And when I finished and I came back home, I got involved in theatre and in music and was part of a band. So arts has always been a part of my life, yeah. So the GoDown, we very proudly recognize it to be 20 years old. We started in 2003. And of course the journey of the GoDown begins at a time when the country was also changing. If you recall 2002, we finally had a sort of success in terms of multi-party politics. We were transitioning from one leader, from President Moi to President Kibaki. And at that time, I think there was a huge youthful energy around the possibilities for the country. And that's when the GoDown started. The GoDown was really riding on that creative energy to try and see how arts and culture could be a democratic force, a force for freedom of expression, but also a way in which we can begin to think about how a Kenyan future is made through the creative energies of young people and of the sector itself. So we started off by trying to be a space that was synergistic, a space that could house many different arts organizations. In the performing arts, you had people who were working with puppetry, you had people who were working with music, you had people who were working with dance and theatre. And then of course in the visual arts or audiovisual arts, you had people who were working with painting and sculpting and people working with film and video. So we were providing a space for artists and arts organizations to be able to have a footprint from which they could work and which of course could be an address to which a public who was interested could begin to see them. And as we began to do this thing, I think one of the things that we noticed was that arts needs to connect with community. There needs to be a point of relevance between what we are doing and where community and society is going. So the GoDown became interested in this question around the intersection of arts and culture with community. So we started to do a lot of activities that were in the mtaas of Nairobi. One of our very big efforts in that direction was the Nairobi Festival, which was this idea of trying to see how does community also become a co-creator with an art center in unearthing, in pulling out our own sense of creativity and culture within this urban space. And so that has been an important trajectory for us because it means that the GoDown has now also been looking at the intersection of culture and being urban and being contemporary. And that's a key part of our work. So the work of the GoDown has now, when we look at it, been really around 4 lines. One is providing space. So how do you provide space for artists to be able to make work, produce work, and interact? The second is really around the training and capacity building for artists as well, because we found that was very key. How does an artist get better at their craft, but also how does the artist become more aware of opportunities that exist in livelihood and things like that? And then the third area, of course, is this area of advocacy that we're very much involved with the Creative Economy Working Group. And then finally, of course, this whole idea of the intersection of community and culture. It's about creating whole communities who are proud of the cultural outputs or the creative outputs from the creative sector, and that they're finding relevance and good connections with those as well. We were very curious around what was happening over the border. What were Ugandan artists doing? What were Tanzanian artists doing? What were the possibilities of connections and exchanges between regional artists? So we began to run a summit that we call the East Africa Art Summit. And this was basically a convening of artists from the region coming together to take stock of what is happening within their territories. And this was a good opportunity to also look at policy questions. What is happening with policy in Uganda and Tanzania and in Kenya that is either enabling or not enabling our activities as the creative sector. So that became a very important space for looking at the question of policy and advocacy. Of course, there were also international exchanges, and in international exchanges we were benchmarking our work against what is happening in Europe and in America. I recall that contemporary dance was one art form that did this, where we had a number of East African artists and Kenyans included, having a long-term exchange. It was about a 5-year exchange with dancers from Moscow of all places, and beginning to see how those particular contexts were quite different politically and economically, but where there was a synergy and a commonality when you began to look at creativity and creation. Kenya is really a wonderfully diverse nation, and the creative expressions that are heritage from that, and beginning to contemporize that, to see what does it look like when we translate some of those traditions and heritage into the contemporary space, into contemporary creativity, and how does that help us begin to define ourselves as Kenyans, or even as Nairobians, if you want to get down to it. I think that is really wonderful to see. Because we're seeing young people who, of course, are very outward looking, but very much also aware that Kenya is the root. Kenya is the root. Now, if Kenya is the root, what do I look like as a Kenyan who has the possibility to draw from all of the creativity from all of the communities of Kenya, but also globally through the exchanges and the connections that we make? How does that begin to help us find and express ourselves as a nation, but also as individuals within the nation, as citizens within the nation? I think that is part of the journey that is very exciting for me to see. I like to look at youth sometimes in the sense of the life cycle of a society. So what is that place and role of youth in a society? And I think that youth really are the roots and the seed of the future of that society. And so they're really important phase and stage in how a society can plan for its future. So the investment that we make in youth, the values that we transmit to youth, the innovation that we allow them to sort of experiment with and explore around new possibilities, things that maybe the older generation are now not confident enough or have become too conservative to do. I think that phase and that stage and that population is so important in giving us a signal of what we will look like in the future, that we really must invest in them. So for me, they're a critical barometer of the possibility of our future, and particularly because they're curious, they're brave, they're foolish in a positive sense. They sort of say, I think we can do that. They're daring. And I think that society needs that in order to be able to move and advance to next levels of itself. Yeah. The Creative Economy Working Group is a wonderful group. I think it's an alliance or a network that shows and proves the value of coming together and amplifying your strengths because you are taking collective action and you're thinking together. So within the Creative Economy Working Group, of course, we are diverse. We are people who are working in film, some are in media, some are in the area of literature, some are in the area of theatre. And so as we practice in these areas, what are our experiences and insights that we can bring from those areas into this question of policy? And so that is really your role, is bring your experience, bring your insight, and then work in concert, work in community to basically build strength in numbers to actually have an impact when we are advocating for some change. Apart from sort of reviewing and discussing policy gaps as a community, at the Creative Economy Working Group, we also then say, how do we then actually achieve change? And so you now need to build relationships with the policymakers, with the legislators. So that is one important thing to do, is not to just advocate and then leave it at that level, but to also sort of say, how do we form relationships where together now we can look at these things and we can see how do we begin to institute change. And then when we institute change, how do we review that change together? So I can give an example. I mean, currently the GoDown is working with Nairobi County. And Nairobi County has a cultural policy, which of course has a lot of work that can be done to it. And Nairobi County is also interested in mapping its creative economy. So we're working together in this space. And what we're finding over there is that the legislator, of course, comes with a particular perspective and a particular understanding. And the person from the practice also comes with particular experiences and insights. So bringing these things together is helping us understand how we can implement strategies and frameworks for data collection, and then bring these into their plans for strategic directions for the sector, bringing it into the CIDP, which is the County Integrated Development Plan. So they're beginning to see how mapping like this can inform work plans and strategies. And we're beginning to see how they're thinking, so that we can see now what value, how do we formulate the work that we're doing in terms of mapping so that it is of value to them as well. We all work in pockets where we have an interest and a talent and a skill. But ultimately, those pockets are part of a larger society or a larger community, and you cannot remove yourself from that. So at one point or another, you'll always find that you're asking yourself, how is what I'm doing in the creative sector relevant or meaningful to the bigger issues and the different issues that are outside of my sector? How should I engage with those? Should I be schizophrenic and sort of say, when I'm in the creative sector, this is what I'm doing? But when I'm now sitting out there and the finance bill is happening and we're all screaming around livelihoods and taxes, is that different or separate? Or what are the connections and what are the intersections between what I do and what is happening on the outside? And I think that is a big and important question, so that we're not acting in a sort of a fragmented way, but we're really seeing how the things that we do wherever we're doing them, when we look at them holistically, that it is part of the ecosystem that is then the nation of Kenya or the city of Nairobi, and that these things need to find a way in which they operate in a way that amplifies and is constructive, not in a way that things cancel out and that things actually then impede or disadvantage each other. So that being aware of what's going on outside, I think, is important, and asking yourself the question, outside of my sector, what is happening? How should I engage with it? And actually, where's the intersection with those things and my sector? I think that is important. So one of the things that the Creative Economy Working Group has seen is that its work is recognized, its impact is recognized by the sector, so that there are other sector actors who are looking to join the Creative Economy Working Group. So over time, the numbers in the working group have expanded. And then I think the other thing that has happened, of course, is that the linkages and the connections and the relationships that the Creative Economy Working Group has with policymakers has also expanded. So we can sort of say that, yes, we know MP so-and-so, or parliamentary committee member so-and-so, or we actually have a good relationship with the Bureau of Statistics and so. So our networks have also expanded. So as that expansion has happened, I think the question now is, what does that mean in terms of how we structure and how we work? The Creative Economy Working Group has now been active for a decade, if I can say so, yeah? And as we engage and continue to engage, and things shift in the society, we also begin to see what other capacities and strengths do we need to build? What questions should we be asking at this particular point in time that we could not ask 10 years ago? And then how do we actually move towards change? So some of the things we've been asking ourselves, for example, is should we formalize this structure of the Creative Economy Working Group? If we formalize it, what does that mean? It means that you're setting up in a particular way. What value does that bring to be a little bit more formal and therefore being able to tackle questions in a more focused way? What are the limits of the way that we're structured now? It's an evolutionary sort of process. And so as you move forward, you begin to appreciate better the limits and the advantages of how you are and what you're doing, and then to think through what are the next steps, how can we become more impactful, what should we do next? And the creative economy has been looking at these questions. I think the process of getting to this project was organic. I think we didn't decide to design a new GoDown just because. I think as we evolved and began to see how the sector was growing and how the space that we were in was inadequate, but also how generally Nairobi City had no civic institutions in culture, we said maybe this is time to think about the evolution of the GoDown in that light. That how do you become a civic institution for Nairobi? Which means that how do you begin to get Nairobi County itself to see that they have a stake in this new GoDown. So the process was one of beginning to think about the design of the building by looking at the city first. So working with planners and architects and with Nairobians, we questioned this idea of Nairobi identity. Who are we as Nairobians? What are these Nairobi neighborhoods? What is culture and heritage in Nairobi in the contemporary sense? Do we recognize our contemporary urban heritage and culture? How should we do that? So it was a process that started around about 2011. Yeah, so some of those early things were really doing studies on the street, understanding how people use the streets, understanding how neighborhoods celebrate themselves, what they say is meaningful for them in Majengo or in Buru or in South Sea, wherever they were. What is meaningful to them? And then beginning to think, how do these things begin to give us an understanding of what a civic institution might look like when you design it and when you eventually build it? So that was a process that took a number of discussions and dialogues over a long time. Then around about 2016, we sort of said, now let's get brave and begin to think about designing the building itself. And again, if you work in an iterative way, it means that the consultants that you're working with, the architects and the planners, are also beginning to synchronize with you in sort of saying that this is a process of consultation, of thinking, of exploring, of experimenting, of analyzing, of reflecting. It's not just design a building for us and we need X studios and so on and so forth. So it was a process that was organic and thoughtful in that way. So by the time you're getting to the design, you're getting to something that is really aware of the neighborhoods of Nairobi. It's really aware of how the city thinks. It's really aware of how the residents think and how the creative sector also is seeing its needs for the future. So it's trying to bring all of these things together. The GoDown transformation is really this process of the redevelopment of the GoDown. So basically, it happens at two levels. One is, of course, the physical change. So you're building a bigger space. We're building a space that, if you're looking at square meterage, you know, the old GoDown was about 7,000 square meters. The new GoDown is 4 times that, so it's about 28,000 square meters, which is massive. And then you're also looking at how that development, that construction, impacts the neighborhood that it sits in terms of an urban intervention. So we've also been looking at the implication and the meaning of that. What does it mean to have a much bigger, now civic institution sitting in this part of the industrial area? What is its impact on the street vendors who were our neighbors, the little hoteliers that we walked across to have lunch in, our neighbors, the community that sits around us who are mostly automotive businesses? What does this mean? So part of what we've been doing there is to actually explore what that means and to engage them in this visioning of the new GoDown and the change that this will bring, so that again the change is something that neighborhood has embraced. The other level is really now the level of the impact of the work of the GoDown, because now of course you're also scaling up the opportunities for the work that you will do. And what we're seeing over there is that aside from scaling up, of course, production spaces for artists and so on, that there's a scale up in terms of the public facing aspect of the GoDown. So what does it mean to have an institution at this scale that is trying to invite the public to be a co-owner, in a sense, of this space, in that you've invited their views, you've asked them to validate the designs and so on and so forth. And what's coming out of that is that the new model of the GoDown is actually a public-facing one that also has libraries that speak to the public. It has a youth center that speaks to the public. It has spaces for children that speak to families. So you're combining this idea of community and creative workers in the same space. So this is something that, of course, at the moment is sitting on paper. We will need to put that into practice once everything is built, and then we'll really see what does it mean to have this kind of a vision, and to work it together between artists and the community to see what does this actually mean. So it's very exciting for us, and we're keen to see how that will play out. When we are thinking about this development, how does this development actually have impacts on other things that are happening around the area? So one of the things that's happening just, sort of south of the GoDown is that the Ngong River runs by us. And as you've seen now, the government is trying to see how do we clear these rivers and how do we develop these rivers. Prior to this happening, the GoDown was already thinking about how does our development also impact the thinking of the county on the urban regeneration of the whole area, including the river area. So now we are very much involved with the Nairobi Rivers Commission on this whole discussion around the development of Nairobi's rivers. And the insights and the angle that we're bringing is how does culture and heritage play a part in this river development and this river planning. And so that is actually a huge thing for Nairobi. If indeed Nairobi succeeds in thinking about how these rivers are part of the development and the formation of the city, then we're having a major change. We're now actually going to be facing our rivers. We're going to be developing a city that is not embarrassed around its rivers. We're not hiding people in the rivers, but we're saying that the rivers is part of our characteristic and the way that we look. Huge vision there. And so we are a part of that vision, but of course a small player in it, but we still feel a very important player in terms of thinking about how does culture and heritage engage in these issues of development and city making for Nairobi County particularly. We're very much aware that one of the things around the creative sector is this whole idea of the digital opportunities that are coming to the sector now, and the way that people are working and monetizing digitally and so on. So in terms of the space is designed to be very flexible. So if there are changes happening within the sector, that you haven't designed studios that are too rigid, too tight, that cannot accommodate the changes that are happening. So it's very much a fluid design, a very open-ended design. I mean, when you look at the designs of the building, it looks very, very firm and fixed. But when you move through the spaces, they actually can be adapted to anything that seems to be important or relevant at that particular point in time. So this idea of flexibility is definitely a core principle. The idea of exploration continues to be a key aspect of what the new GoDown will be thinking about, experimenting and thinking about how does innovation continue to be at the center of what the GoDown is doing. But then I think also this idea of inclusivity is important because of course when you build a new swanky looking building, sometimes certain populations and certain communities begin to think, this is not for us. And we have been having those discussions by saying that this vision and this dream of the GoDown is really one that has drawn on the imaginations of many hundreds and thousands of Nairobians. And so as it comes to life, let's also embrace it and let's also believe that it is ours. So let's not feel that suddenly there'll be an askari at the gate who's telling me, unaenda wapi? Who are you? So we're also saying that inclusivity is important. And how will that new GoDown enable people to feel comfortable, to feel included, to feel that this really is their space, no matter who you are and no matter which neighborhood of Nairobi you're coming from. So I think one of the huge successes that has happened is that the city of Nairobi has adopted this project as a flagship development for Nairobi as well. This is new for the city. What does it mean to be in partnership with an organization in the creative sector who is redeveloping an institution and saying that this is a flagship for Nairobi? And we're both discovering what that means. But that is important, that process of different stakeholders beginning to have ownership of this particular building and this particular process. The wonderful process of collaboration, we think that is a huge success. And we're trying to lean on that same process of collaboration to realize the building, particularly in terms of the fundraising. The mobilization of community enabled us to raise enough to at least be able to excavate the premises. So now we have a fantastic hole, and now we need to now continue to do the fundraising to be able to build out of the hole. The history of this sector is that the money has come from outside. Is it possible that we can flip this idea and sort of say, how can Kenya be the main stakeholder in terms of the financing of this building. So we have a strategy where ordinary wananchi can give whatever they give. It doesn't matter. It can be 50 bob, it can be 50,000 bob. It doesn't matter. But it's just your own sense that this is important to me. Let me make a contribution towards it. Then, of course, we have Kenyans who have a bit more means. And we've also been reaching out to them saying, when you're looking at your own legacy, is this a space that could be one of the legacies for you? And then, of course, we've got local and county and national governments. What is their role in enabling this vision to be realized? So in looking at these things, we're sort of saying that if this goes well, then hopefully 60+% of the money to build the new GoDown has come from home, and that we've actually flipped the equation. Because typically 60+% of support to the sector tends to come from outside. And we're trying to say this one is ours. Let's try and flip it and do it in a different way, which means that it is slow work, because it is the work of education, it is the work of trying to get buy-in, and then of course you had COVID that interrupted a momentum and so on and so forth. You know, when we first put out the call, actually the reaction from various community members was fantastic, because some of the way that you can come into the project is what is the skill or the knowledge that you have. And we had people saying, I'm a QS, I can do this, I'm a such and such, I can do the other. And all of this is fantastic. So one is in-kind support, particularly in the public space around the GoDown. Once that is happening, in order to turn those streets around, I'm sure Nairobi County will appreciate support from young people, particularly, in terms of realizing physically, you know, who is moving the stones, who is doing this to help build the road or to change the road that is coming from the community area. And of course, how are we remunerating them? I think that is an important part. So we are keen to see how youthful skills can be a key part of building this new GoDown. It is a challenge because, of course, a contractor comes in, they know how they work, they know the skill that the skilled labor that they typically work with, and we're trying to encourage them to embrace a little bit more, open up, work a little bit differently, and bring in people from the neighborhood who probably are not that skilled but can be useful in the process, so they also feel that they built it. We've been in conversation with a group that works with young women in construction. They're called Build Her. And when they were starting out, we were just doing our designs, and we had a chat with them, and we said, you know, the woman who runs it is a wonderful woman called Tatu Gatere. We said, Tatu, these women need to build the GoDown. And at that point, the women were just learning woodwork, very simple woodwork skills. And I said, it doesn't matter. We are still on a journey of trying to raise the money. Hopefully by the time that we start the building, we can incorporate these community women, and these are, you know, women, single mothers who are coming out of Kariobangi, Dandora, that area, who are skilling under the Build Her program. How can they actually be a key part of building this new GoDown? And I'm seeing now that their own program has advanced quite a bit. Their talent with woodwork has increased. I'm seeing now that they've also learned how to paint. They've also learned how to tile. And these are skills that we will need in that process. And what we are keen on is to also disrupt the way that a contractor works. So we are going to encourage the contractor who comes on board to really think in an open-minded way and sort of say, how can I bring community members on board to be part of the building of this new GoDown? So we are trying to disrupt a number of different practices in this process. Some will be easy, some will be hard. But hopefully that is one way in which ordinary people can come into the process with their skills, if not their money. So the timeline for us is that we phase it. So we're saying that excavation is one phase. The next phase is building out of the hole and coming back to the street level, and maybe being able to have some structures that we can occupy at that street level. And then we'll say the next ones will also then come iteratively.